The mud was cold under my knees, and my hands were tied so tightly that I could not feel my fingers anymore. Smoke rose from the burning wheat field behind me, curling into a sky that no longer felt like ours. 3 hours ago, that sky had been full of birds. Now it was full of ships that did not belong to Earth. My name is Daniel Reyes, and I was a soldier in the 3rd Human Defense Line, though by that point there was not much of a line left. Our unit had been pushed back for 6 days straight. We had lost our radios, half our ammunition, and most of our friends. What remained of us knelt in rows across the field, watched over by creatures that looked like they had crawled out of a nightmare and decided to stay. The aliens called themselves the Vorath. We had only learned that name a week earlier, whispered between prisoners who had survived long enough to hear it more than once. They were tall, taller than any human I had ever seen, with hard shells covering their arms and shoulders like natural armor. Their faces had no lips, only mandibles that clicked together when they spoke, and their eyes were black and endless, giving away nothing. They had arrived without warning, no signal, no message, no attempt to talk. One day, the sky above every major city on Earth simply opened, and ships the size of mountains slid out of the clouds. By the time our governments finished arguing about what to do, the Vorath had already landed. What they wanted was simple, and they made sure we understood it quickly. They wanted us to kneel, not as a metaphor, not as a figure of speech. They wanted every human being on the planet to physically bow before them, city by city, as a sign that we accepted their rule. Those who refused were removed from the count of the living. That was the phrase their translators used, removed from the count of the living, as if we were numbers on a page instead of people with names and mothers and half-finished plans for the weekend. I did not understand at first why they wanted this so badly. Conquerors in old human stories usually wanted land, or resources, or power. The Vorath had ships that could cross 60 light-years of empty space. They did not need our farmland. They did not need our rivers. What they seemed to need, more than anything, was for us to admit that we were smaller than them. That was the piece I could not accept, not the losing. Losing happens. Every army loses sometimes. Every person fails sometimes, and there is no shame in a fair fight going the other way. What I could not accept was the asking. The idea that before they had even tried to understand who we were, they had already decided the only acceptable answer was surrender. The warrior in front of me now was different from the others I had seen. Its shell had a deep groove running down one arm, an old injury that had healed wrong, giving it a slightly crooked stance. Its voice, when the translator rendered it, was lower and rougher than the others, as if it had spent a very long time giving orders and did not enjoy repeating itself. "I will destroy you, human, if you do not bow," it said, its mandibles clicking sharply with each word. I looked up at it. I thought about my grandfather, who had survived a war on the other side of the world when he was younger than I was now. He used to tell me that courage was not about not being afraid. It was about doing the right thing while you were afraid, because the fear did not go away just because you decided to be brave. You simply learned to carry it along with everything else. "No," I said. The field went very quiet. Even the fires seemed to crackle more softly. Beside me, kneeling in the mud with her hands bound the same way mine were, Priya Nair let out a breath through her teeth. She had been my friend since basic training, the kind of friend who tells you the truth even when you would rather hear something kind instead. She did not look at me. She kept her eyes forward, the way we had been trained to do, but I could feel her tension beside me like heat from a fire. "You understand what happens next," the warrior said. It leaned down slightly, and I could smell something like burnt metal coming off its breathing slits. "I understand you flew 60 light-years to say hello by pointing a weapon at us," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. Maybe fear does that sometimes. Maybe it burns away the shaking and leaves only the words. "You did not ask who we are. You did not ask what we wanted. You told us to kneel before you even learned our names." "Names are unnecessary," the warrior said. "Only obedience matters." "That is where you are wrong," I said. "Names are the whole point. My name is Daniel. Hers is Priya. We are not a number you can remove from a count. We are people, and people do not bow just because someone bigger tells them to." The warrior's claws flexed at its sides, slow and deliberate. I understood, in a distant sort of way, that this might be the last conversation I would ever have. But strangely, I was not thinking about dying. I was thinking about every person in human history who had ever been told to give up and had not. Bowing is not death, the warrior said. It is survival. I offer you a choice that many of your kind have already accepted. Some people accept it because they are trying to protect their families, I said. I understand that. I do not judge them for it. But I am not protecting anyone today except the idea that we get to decide who we are. And I am not giving that up just because you are stronger than me. For a moment, the warrior did not move. Its black eyes studied me the way you might study a puzzle that refuses to solve the way you expected. I had the strange feeling that no human had ever spoken to it quite like this before. Perhaps they had all been too afraid. Perhaps I was too afraid as well, and simply too stubborn to let the fear win the argument. Then you will kneel anyway, it said finally. Whether you choose it or not. Maybe, I said. But there is a difference between kneeling because you made me and kneeling because I agreed. You can force my knees into the mud. You cannot force my mind to agree with you. That part stays mine, no matter what you do to the rest of me. I do not know exactly what I expected to happen next. Perhaps I expected the warrior to end the conversation the way its kind usually ended conversations with humans who refused. Instead, it tilted its head, a very slightly human gesture, almost like curiosity. Your species is small, it said. Your bodies break easily. Your cities burn easily. Why do you speak as though you have already won something? Because we have, I said. You wanted us to believe we were nothing before the fighting even started. That is why you announced yourselves the way you did. That is why every warrior who captures a group of us gives the same speech about bowing. You are not just trying to conquer our planet. You are trying to conquer the way we think about ourselves. And every time one of us says no, that part of your plan fails, even if everything else about the day goes badly for us. The warrior made a sound I had not heard before, somewhere between a growl and a huff. I could not tell if it was anger or something closer to surprise. You are a strange creature, Daniel, it said, using my name for the first time. Something about hearing my name in that flat translated voice made the moment feel even stranger than it already was. I get that a lot, I said. It was in that pause, that strange half-second where the warrior seemed to be deciding something, that the sky changed. At first it was only a sound, a distant rolling thunder that did not belong to the wind or the fires. Then it grew louder, sharper, resolving into the unmistakable roar of engines. Not Vurath engines. I had heard those enough times over the past 6 days to know their pitch, their rhythm, and this was different. This was ours. Every head on that field turned upward at once, guards and prisoners together, drawn by the same instinct. 3 shapes broke through the smoke and low clouds, moving in tight formation, human ships that should not have still existed after everything the Vurath had already done to our fleets. I learned later that it was the remains of 2 different squadrons, merged together in secret over the previous 2 days, by commanders who refused to accept that the war was already over. They had been waiting for exactly this kind of moment, a large gathering of Vurath forces out in the open, away from their heaviest defenses. It was a desperate plan built from desperate pieces, the kind of plan you only try when you have almost nothing left to lose. The warrior in front of me snapped its attention toward the sky, its whole body tensing. For one heartbeat, its focus was entirely on the threat above, not on the human kneeling in the mud in front of it. I had spent 6 days listening to prisoners whisper information to each other in the dark, trading scraps of knowledge like currency. One of those scraps was a location, a cluster of sensitive nerve endings along the side of a Vurath throat, just beneath the lowest edge of their armor plating. Our scientists had discovered it from studying injured Vurath soldiers, and the knowledge had passed from unit to unit like a secret handshake, something to hold on to in case the moment ever came. The moment had come. I threw myself forward, my bound hands catching the warrior high on its neck, striking the soft cluster of nerves with everything my tied arms could manage. It was not a strong blow. My hands were still numb from the ropes, and I had no real training in exactly where or how hard to strike. But it did not need to be strong. It only needed to be accurate. The warrior let out a sound unlike anything I had heard from it before, sharp and involuntary, and staggered backward, one clawed hand pressing against its throat. It was not badly hurt. I do not think a human fist could truly injure something built the way they were built. But it was surprised, and for a creature that size, surprise was almost as good as an actual setback. "Down!" Priya shouted, already twisting her bound wrists behind her back in a motion we had practiced 100 times in training, but never actually needed until now. I dropped flat into the mud beside her, as the ships overhead opened fire on the Varath transports lined up at the edge of the field. The next several minutes blurred together the way intense moments always do. There was noise, and light, and the ground shaking beneath us. There was shouting in at least 3 languages, human voices calling out orders and warnings, some of them cracking with fear, all of them refusing to stop. There was the sight of Varath soldiers scattering to defend their equipment, their perfect discipline breaking for just a moment under the shock of an attack they had not expected from an enemy they believed was already defeated. I do not remember exactly how Priya managed to cut through my restraints. I remember the sharp edge of a blade, probably taken from a fallen guard, sawing quickly through the plastic ties around my wrists. I remember my hands finally free, stinging with the return of feeling, and I remember grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the tree line at the edge of the field, away from the worst of the fighting. We were not the only ones who ran. All around us, other prisoners were doing the same thing, some of them helping each other up, some of them simply running on instinct, driven by the sudden, precious gift of a distracted enemy. Not everyone made it. I will not pretend that day ended without loss, because it did not. War does not offer clean victories, and that field cost us people I will remember for the rest of my life. But by the time the ships above finished their attack run and turned to retreat toward whatever base they had come from, 12 of us had reached the trees, breathless, muddy, and alive. I looked back once before we disappeared into the forest. The warrior with the crooked arm was still standing near where I had left it, surrounded by the chaos of its retreating soldiers. It was not looking at the ships anymore. It was looking at the empty patch of mud where I had been kneeling only minutes before. I do not know what that creature was thinking in that moment. I never saw it again, and I have no way of knowing whether it survived the war that followed, or what it told its commanders about the strange human who had refused to bow and then struck back the very first chance it got. Sometimes I imagine it reporting the encounter honestly, warning its superiors that humans were more dangerous than expected, not because of our weapons, but because of our stubbornness. Other times, I imagine it never mentioning me at all, embarrassed that a bound and kneeling prisoner had managed to catch it off guard. Either way, something changed in me on that field, something that stayed with me through the rest of the war and the difficult years of rebuilding that came after. I learned that being smaller than your enemy does not mean you have already lost. I learned that words matter, that refusing an unfair demand is its own kind of resistance, even before any other action is taken. And I learned that hope, real hope, is not the belief that things will definitely turn out fine. It is the decision to keep standing anyway, even when you cannot promise yourself a happy ending. We never became the kind of story that gets carved into monuments. There was no parade for the 12 of us who walked out of that forest, no medal ceremony broadcast across the world. Most people who hear about that day only remember it as one small skirmish among thousands during a long and difficult war. But I remember it as the day I learned something about myself that no one could ever take back, no matter what else happened afterward. The Varath wanted us to believe that being conquered was simply a matter of time, that resistance was pointless against a species so far beyond us in strength and technology. Maybe, in the end, they were right about a great deal of it. The war was long, and it cost us more than I can easily put into words. But they were wrong about one thing, and it was the one thing that mattered most in that muddy field on that particular afternoon. They believed that if they were strong enough, we would eventually agree that we deserved to lose. We never did. Every time a Varath warrior stood over a kneeling human and demanded a bow, somewhere among the prisoners there was always someone who said no first, and then everyone around them found the courage to say it too. It did not always save us. It did not always end in rescue ships arriving at the perfect moment. But it meant something, every single time, and I have come to believe that meaning is not a small thing at all. It might be the largest thing a person can hold on to when everything else has been taken away. I still think about that warrior sometimes, the crooked line of its arm, the surprise in its voice when I refused. I think about the 200,000 years of human stubbornness that stood up inside me in that single moment, passed down through every ancestor who had ever refused to give up, when giving up would have been so much easier. They keep asking us to bow. We are still working on the answer, and I suspect we always will be.